Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. We're going to kick off 2015 with the Ki-43 Hayabusa, or more commonly known to the Allies as the Oscar. Why did I pick this plane? I felt like it doesn't get enough recognition or love from the War Thunder and kind of international community. This was a plane that I believe was the second most produced warplane of Japan, and it saw action from 1941 to 1945, so I felt like it needed a little love. And if you're not too familiar with this little plane, I think you'll learn something. So this was made by Nakojima, and it was given the Hayabusa is not an official designation that was given to it, but in English that stands for Barrack-1 Falcon. This plane was designed to be a replacement to the Ki-27. So it was designed in 1937. First prototypes flew in 1939. It was put into production in 1941. That's a lot of years for a span of kind of a plane of that time, especially in war. It had some issues, and I'm going to talk about those issues later. But this plane did see production from 1941 to 1945. I believe 2 or 3 different countries produced it, and it saw service in probably another handful of those too. So you look at the design of this aircraft, and it's a really little aircraft. I was actually shocked when I saw kind of the fuselage of one in real life in a storage barn of a collector that lives near here. And it's a really small aircraft. I couldn't even fathom how small it is. Not like it's tiny, but it's just, for a warbird, I think it's pretty on the small side. But it's a clean looking aircraft, and it has these nice kind of tapered lines, kind of like starts out, of course the radio engine that kind of tapers back to the tail, has these nice rounded tails and wings, and I think it's a pretty good looking aircraft. It started out life with a 2-blade propeller. They switched that to a 3-bladed prop. We'll talk about that. And the early variants didn't have any armor or any self-sealing fuel tanks, so it was pretty standard for Japan. But this plane was produced until 1945, so this thing saw a pretty good service life in World War II. There's 3 main variants, and I've been yelled at by people in the comments before for doing this, but I think this is the best way I can do for Japan. Is basically called, there's Ki-43-1, Ki-43-2, Ki-43-3, and that's why I see it listed in every documentation. A lot of the documentation I see kind of like either post-war or during the war it's just basically called Ki-43 Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3. We're going to go with that just to make it simple. And so there was 5,886 produced, but I've also found numbers up to 5,919, so we'll just call it 5,900 of these things were made. There was 33 prototypes, and the primary engine used for all these was a Nakajima HA-115 14-cylinder radial, producing about 1,100 or so horsepower. Those numbers differ too, but this engine did have different variants of a supercharger. We'll talk about that, and this plane did go through different kind of armament upgrades, but they're kind of, I'll talk about that too. The armament's kind of interesting on this thing as well. The important thing to know about this thing's design, though, was the butterfly combat flaps. What the hell is a butterfly combat flap? It's probably, you probably more know it as a, like almost as a flower flap. But next time you take off, and I'll put video of this right now, next time you take off, just look underneath your Ki-43, and you'll see the flaps, when you go from landing to raised, does this kind of, instead of pushing down, it kind of pushes backwards. It's kind of cool. But this was what gave the Ki-43 a huge advantage in the churn fight. And this really, in the early prototypes, they were not happy how this thing churned compared to the Ki-27. They added this, and they were very pleased with its result. And due to this, some people say, and I probably believe this, that the Ki-43 was a better churn fighter than the Zero. I believe the Zero was probably the better plane overall, but the Ki-43 would outturn a Zero. No, and I'm not looking up numbers for that. I'm just making that statement. Just looking at design, I'd probably believe that. I'm sure I could pull up all kinds of stats, but we're not going to do that. We're not here for that. But I think the butterfly combat flaps is probably the most important design feature on this plane, besides just being lightweight and nimble. So let's kick it off with talking with the variants. We have the Ki-43 Mark 1. And when you say Mark 1, that's the one that's in game. You see as, the one that was added, I think, in like 1.43. Whenever you see Ki-40 Mark 1, Mark 2, Mark 3, with no other letters behind it, that was the prototype designation. When you add a letter behind it, that's actually the in-service or production designation. And that's one thing that I think War Thunder messed up a little bit, but I think they're only going to add 3 variants, and they're just trying to keep it simple, stupid, dumb, which, whatever. Ki-43 Mark 1A was a 980 horsepower HA-25 Type 99 radial engine. Had a single-speed supercharger, had a fixed-pitch wooden 2-blade propeller, so very, very basic plane. It had 2 7.7mm Type 89 machine guns. I've seen a couple sources saying it had Type 97s, but I'm going to bet money that it was probably the Type 89 99% of times. I think the Type 97 is just a little bit of misinformation. Had a telescopic sight which went through the windshield, and you can see that in game 2. They added that feature not too long ago in the game. So it has that weird massive telescopic windshield. You probably see a little footage of me messing around with that. Now, as the 12.7mm HO-103s came available, those were added in, and that became designation 1B at that point. Now, I could not find any documentation, even though I think a lot of historians will say that the Mark 1A saw combat. I think that with the two, I don't think any two, like all I could find was the 7.7mm were used was basically either in training or non-combat service role. Every time they were in combat, they got their hands on those HO-103 12.7mm. I could not actually find any real documentation on 7.7mm being the primary gun in combat. And I could be wrong, but I think that's just a little bit of twisted history that depending on whose book or what article you read, you see some different information. So, Mark 1B, 12.7mm, and then one thing that came up with this plane's design problems was when the plane would do a high-speed dive, the wings would actually fold in. And if you've ever seen a video of wings folding in on a plane, they just kind of crumple and collapse upward. It's terrifying. Hope I never see that in real life. But that is one of the problems that this plane faced, and then they, quote, modified that. I don't think they quite fixed it. I don't think that fix came until the KI-43 Mark II. But they modified it, and they were able to put 250 rounds per gun. That became standard. And they were able to attach little bitty, I think, like 50 or 100 kilogram bombs under the wings. And that became the Mark 1C. So, there are 76 of these, there's 716 of these things built, and about 80 of them were not Mark 1C. So Mark 1C was the primary version of this plane. So 716 built, 80 were non-Mark 1Cs. That's what I'm trying to spit out. This early plane did see a lot of success against the Hurricane and the Buffalo, especially around Burma and a few other places. This plane did succeed or excel in the early war theater. The primary plane, though, that you need to know about is the KI-43 Mark II. That is the one that the most were built, and the one that saw the most service history. This is the one, though, that I could find that really a lot of books and articles start referencing it as the Oscar. So I don't think the KI-43 Mark I is, truly an Oscar. I think KI-43 Mark II is the designation Oscar comes into play, at least from the Allied sense. I mean, they were getting the KI-43 confused with Zero, so I don't think it really matters what they're calling it, but I just found that kind of interesting that the designation Oscar didn't really start until the Mark II. The Mark II has numerous upgrades. First one being its HE-115 1500, or sorry, not HA-115 1150 horsepower, so 2-stage supercharger, 3-blade propeller, and blah blah. So it had great engine upgrades. Majority of the Mark IIs used the HO-103 12.7mm. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Actually, we'll talk about it right now. Pilots didn't like this. Two 12.7mm, it sounds like a good upgrade over the two 7.7s. Problem is that when you get those, and these are firing the Beretta ammo, when you're using some machine guns, they have an incredibly low rate of fire. And it's probably nothing more frustrating when you're using a turn fighter, and you have a slow rate of fire when you're trying to get those deflection shots, and you just can't get the rounds out fast enough. So a large majority of the pilots had their armor switch the armament to one HO-103 and one Type 89 machine gun. Now I'm going to talk about the ammo a bit, is that they use the Beretta 12.7mm ammo that's found kind of like in the MC202 in game. It has 8 grams of PETN. If you're not familiar with PETN, I've talked about in a previous podcast. Just Google it. I won't go into too much detail with that right now. That was imported from Italy early on. It had 2 problems. It either jammed the gun or worse things happen. And there's nothing like having a little HE grenade going off in your cowling of your aircraft to probably cause pretty bad problems. This issue was cleared up when the ammo was actually made in Japan. So we're going to go to the Mark IIA, which was the first production model of the Mark II. And it could carry up to 500 kilogram bombs, so I take it that they fixed the wing spar issue, if they could hold that big a bomb. It had a bigger engine, like I mentioned. They changed the wingtips, and I see some people call it clipped or cropped or whatnot, but they kind of rounded and shortened up the wing a little bit. They added a 3-bladed propeller. They added a new gun sight. The cannons became, the machine guns became standard, of course. Then you had the 13 millimeters of head and back armor, and they had a basic rudimentary self-sealing fuel tank added to that plane as well. The Mark IIB designation, from what I could tell, is where they added in radio equipment, and that was it. So, does War Thunder need to have a Mark IIA and a Mark IIB? Well, the Mark IIB is not going to really do anything if it's just radios. I could be wrong, but that's all the information I could find is Mark IIB was just radios. So this is the plane that saw a lot of combat, and I'll get to that a little bit later in the podcast talking about its combat service, but this is the plane that saw a majority of the fighting. The final version was the KI-43 Type 3, which came recently in 1.45. That came in 1944. That used the HA-115 Type 2, or number 2 engine, Mark II, I don't know what to call that. And it had about a 40 from what I could see, about a 40 horsepower improvement with kind of thing. How you can tell is you can tell Mark III easily because it has these exhaust pipes. You can see it in the model War Thunder. Exhaust pipes that stick through the cowling. That's probably the most noticeable thing you can tell. 1,100 of these were built from October 44 to June 45. Most of the focus, though, in late war for the Japanese Army was building the Ki-84, though. Mark IIB was when the 20mm cannons arrived with the HO-5. That's what we have in game. I could not find any data of these things really existing besides 2 prototypes. I could be wrong, but I didn't see these things in mass service. One last Ki-43 to notice was the Ki-62 quotation marks project. This was a dedicated interceptor with a much more powerful engine. It's a bigger engine, but much more powerful engine. It was going to use either 30 or 40 millimeter cannons. This never went into fruition. This was just a idea. So combat service, this plane saw a lot of service in many different theaters in the Pacific War. This was a plane that was highly effective early on. And it was pretty quickly passed up too. One of the reasons being, early on they're fighting things like buffaloes and wildcats and cute little hurricanes and warways and all that stuff. Then hellcats and bowfighters and mosquitoes and corsairs showed up on the scene. And so far, and then the Ki-43 wasn't so cute. You can only do so much with 2 machine guns, no matter how good a pilot you are. And it doesn't help that you're sitting kind of on a bomb with with your lack of armor. So I think this plane did very well, and from what I could tell, the Japanese Army and the Japanese pilots that flew it really liked this plane. It just was a little bit outclassed when it became late war, and that's why the Ki-84 started taking over. That being said, you didn't see the super high casualties until newer untrained pilots started taking over. Of course, that was the problem with all access countries. As the longer the war went on, the less trained their pilots were trying to replace them. Now, when you ask me what should the Ki-43 be most famous for, and at least me sitting here as an American, I will always remember the Ki-43 as the opponent to the Flying Tigers and their P-40s. But it did see service with other countries. It did see service in Indonesia and here and there. But it also, one thing I didn't know is that it was used as a homeland defense plane, especially around Tokyo. That was the preferred plane to defend the homeland. And in the late war, this is something else I found out in my research for this, is that they were used as kamikazes, like a lot of others were. But most Ki-43 units were replaced by the Ki-84 towards the end of the war. That was the plane they preferred. Ki-43 still did see widespread service through many units and other countries until the end of the war. So I think this plane has a place in history. And it was still effective till the end of the war. I saw a list of like B-24s, mosquitoes, bowfighters, you name it, it took them down. This little plane with its 2 little guns still fought on hard. So good for those pilots for, making the best of what they had. And lastly, I'll comment this real quick. There's several survivors of this plane existing. The plane I saw I would not call survivor. It looked like flak torn to pieces. But there's about 8 or 10 survivors around the world. And so there's some in the States. There's a couple in China, or 1 or 2 in China, 1 in Japan. There's a couple in England of all places. So anyway, this plane you can see in museums around the world. And before I die, I'd actually like to see one in a museum in a restored condition, because I think it's it's a neat little plane. Am I saying this is by far in the top 10 planes of World War II? No, but I think it has a place in history. So, before I wrap this up, I am trying to make 2015... the podcast was received a lot better than I initially thought it would be on the channel, and I'm glad. I enjoyed doing this. I love history, and I'm glad I get to share this with you guys. If you have topics that you'd like me to cover, or Kobe to cover, or Firefly, or any of us, I mean, we have a, kind of, I wouldn't say a wealth of knowledge, but we do have very knowledgeable people here. I hope I can get, possibly Bismarck or some of the other, if you want a German perspective, a Polish, a Russian, an American, we can do it. I just need to know what would you guys like to see in the future. So feel free to leave a comment below. And you can also go over to the Steam group. We have a discussion going over there about podcast topic ideas. So if there's something you'd like to see in 2015 that us cover, we can do that for you. And lastly, if I said anything in this podcast that you don't agree with, where you're like, well, that's wrong, I did try to source this between 2 or 3 books and about 15 or so internet articles. If I say something that you believe is incorrect, please give me a cited article, because there's nothing, I mean, it doesn't infuriate me, but somebody says, well, that's wrong. And I'm like, well, just show me I'm wrong. That's all I ask. Anyway, let's have a great year with the podcast, and just let me know what you want to hear. Thanks for listening.